The blade pressed deeper into Sienna's throat, drawing a thin crimson line that trickled down her pale skin. Yuri's breath reeked of vodka and violence as he leaned in close, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you are a hero, little whore." He laughed, the sound like bones snapping in the dark. "You are nothing. Just another piece of street trash I am going to throw away." Behind Yuri, 3 Bratva soldiers pinned down the trembling 9-year-old girl. Lily's eyes were wide with terror, locked onto Sienna's battered face. She had stopped screaming. Now she just watched this gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and silver-gray eyes who had thrown herself between her and the monsters. Sienna's fingers tightened around her rusted metal rod, her only weapon, her only companion through 7 years of hell. The iron was slick with her own blood, mixing with the rust like old wounds meeting new. She could taste copper on her tongue. Her vision blurred at the edges, 3 cracked rigs screaming with every shallow breath, but she did not let go. She never let go. "Get your hands off that child." Sienna's voice came out as a broken rasp, barely more than a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the night. In the distance, growing louder like approaching thunder, came the unmistakable roar of 12-cylinder engines. The ground began to vibrate as blinding high beams washed over the filthy concrete. A fleet of black, armored SUVs tore through the freezing rain, their heavy tires screeching violently as the lead vehicle slammed to a halt right at Yuri's feet. The monsters had no idea that a much bigger, much deadlier king had just arrived. The doors burst open before the engine even cut off. Men poured out into the freezing rain, moving with terrifying precision. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. The air erupted into a deafening symphony of gunfire and shattered glass. Yuri shoved Sienna hard to the ground to draw his weapon, but a bullet tore through his shoulder before his fingers even grazed the cold metal. Sienna hit the concrete, her fractured ribs grinding together with a sickening crunch that echoed in her own skull. She curled inward, gasping for air that felt like swallowing razor blades, yet her silver-gray eyes stayed locked on Lily. A giant of a man with storm-gray eyes and a tailored suit steeped in power stepped out of the lead vehicle. Lucian Moretti did not run, but the earth seemed to tremble beneath his measured, lethal strides. The Bratva soldiers who held Lily dropped like severed puppets as Lucian's men eliminated them with cold, calculated efficiency, their blood pooling instantly in the rain-soaked gutters. Lily scrambled backward, her pink dress smeared with street dirt and crimson stains, until she saw the towering man approaching. "Daddy," she cried, a broken, desperate sound that pierced right through the fading gunfire. Lucian dropped to his knees right there in the mud and filth, pulling the trembling child into his broad chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, his massive frame shaking violently as he held his entire world in his arms. Sienna watched them through a rapidly darkening haze. Her vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into pitch blackness. The rusted iron bar finally slipped from her numb, freezing fingers, clattering against the pavement with a hollow ring. It was over. The innocent girl was safe. She had kept her promise this time, redeeming a soul she thought was lost forever. A strange, heavy peace settled over her bruised body as the adrenaline bled away, leaving nothing but an all-consuming exhaustion. She let her hollow cheek rest against the freezing wet stone, her eyelids fluttering shut, waiting for the familiar embrace of nothingness. But the silence she expected did not come. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approached, stopping mere inches from her face. Sienna forced her eyes open a sliver, met by the sight of immaculate, custom leather shoes soaked in street rain and gang blood. Lucian Moretti knelt beside her, handing his weeping daughter to a trusted, heavily armed guard before turning his intense, storm-gray gaze fully onto the broken woman at his feet. Up close, the Mafia King possessed a chilling, untouchable beauty, a face carved from marble and shadow, but his eyes held an unreadable tempest as they swept over her starved frame, her ragged thrift store clothes, and the deep crimson stain expanding rapidly across her side. "You saved her," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated deep in her own chest. "You threw yourself in front of them for my child." Sienna tried to speak, to tell him she did not want his dirty money or his pity, but only a wet, choking cough escaped her split lips. The world tilted violently on its axis. The cold concrete seemed to open up beneath her, dragging her down into the dark, pulling her under the waves of shock and blood loss. "Don't close your eyes," Lucian commanded, the chilling authority in his tone cracking with raw, unexpected panic. He did not care about the city grime coating her pale skin or the blood soaking into her worn fabric. The ruthless boss of the Chicago underworld slid his powerful arms beneath her broken body, lifting her fragile weight against his pristine cashmere suit with terrifying gentleness. "Get the trauma team ready at the estate," he roared over his shoulder, his voice echoing over the police sirens beginning to wail in the far distance. "Tell them if she dies, they all die." Sienna felt the jarring heat of his broad chest, enveloped entirely by the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and fresh gunpowder, before the darkness finally pulled her under, carrying her away from the freezing streets and straight into the beating heart of a world she never asked to enter. The blade pressed deeper into Sienna's throat, drawing a thin crimson line that trickled down her pale skin. Yuri's breath reeked of vodka and violence as he leaned in close, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're a hero, little whore." He laughed, the sound like bones snapping in the dark. "You're nothing. Just another piece of street trash I'm going to throw away." Behind Yuri, 3 Bratva soldiers pinned down the trembling 9-year-old girl. Lily's eyes were wide with terror, locked onto Sienna's battered face. She had stopped screaming. Now she just watched this gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and silver-gray eyes who had thrown herself between her and the monsters. Sienna's fingers tightened around her rusted metal rod, her only weapon, her only companion through 7 years of hell. The iron was slick with her own blood, mixing with the rust like old wounds meeting new. She could taste copper on her tongue. Her vision blurred at the edges, 3 cracked ribs screaming with every shallow breath, but she didn't let go. She never let go. "Get your hands off that child." Sienna's voice came out as a broken rasp, barely more than a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the night. In the distance, growing louder like approaching thunder, came the unmistakable purr of luxury engines. Black SUVs, 5 of them, 10. The convoy of death dressed in Italian leather and cold vengeance. Yuri's smile faltered. He had no idea what he had just started. He had no idea whose daughter he had tried to take. He had no idea that the man coming for him had burned entire empires to ash for lesser offenses. And he had absolutely no idea that this broken woman, bleeding on the cold concrete, this homeless survivor who had already crawled through hell and refused to stay dead, was about to become the most protected soul in Chicago's criminal underworld. A living legend. The shield of the Moretti Empire. Forged not from wealth or blood ties, but from a rusted metal rod and a heart that simply would not stop beating for the innocent. The deafening screech of armored tires against wet asphalt shattered the standoff as the lead vehicle slammed to a halt inches from Yuri's legs. The doors burst open before the engine even cut off. Men poured out into the freezing rain, moving with terrifying precision. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. The air erupted into a chaotic symphony of silenced gunfire and shattered glass. Yuri shoved Sienna hard to the ground to draw his weapon, but a bullet tore through his shoulder before his fingers even grazed the cold metal. Sienna hit the concrete, her fractured ribs grinding together with a sickening crunch that echoed in her own skull. She curled inward, gasping for air that felt like swallowing razor blades, yet her silver-gray eyes stayed locked on Lily. A giant of a man with storm-gray eyes and a tailored suit steeped in power stepped out of the lead vehicle. Lucian Moretti did not run, but the earth seemed to tremble beneath his measured, lethal strides. The Bratva soldiers who held Lily dropped like severed puppets as Lucian's men eliminated them with cold, calculated efficiency, their blood pooling instantly in the rain. Soaked gutters. Lily scrambled backward, her pink dress smeared with street dirt and crimson stains, until she saw the towering man approaching. "Daddy," she cried, a broken, desperate sound that pierced right through the fading gunfire. Lucian dropped to his knees right there in the mud and filth, pulling the trembling child into his broad chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, his massive frame shaking violently as he held his entire world in his arms. Sienna watched them through a rapidly darkening haze. Her vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into pitch blackness. The rusted iron bar finally slipped from her numb, freezing fingers, clattering against the pavement with a hollow ring. It was over. The innocent girl was safe. She had kept her promise this time, redeeming a soul she thought was lost forever. A strange, heavy peace settled over her bruised body as the adrenaline bled away, leaving nothing but an all-consuming exhaustion. She let her hollow cheek rest against the freezing wet stone, her eyelids fluttering shut, waiting for the familiar embrace of nothingness. But the silence she expected did not come. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approached, stopping mere inches from her face. Sienna forced her eyes open a sliver, met by the sight of immaculate, custom leather shoes soaked in street rain and gang blood. Lucian Moretti knelt beside her, handing his weeping daughter to a trusted guard before turning his intense, storm-gray gaze fully onto the broken woman at his feet. Up close, the Mafia King possessed a chilling, untouchable beauty, a face carved from marble and shadow, but his eyes held an unreadable tempest as they swept over her stark frame, her ragged thrift store clothes, and the deep crimson stain expanding rapidly across her side. "You saved her," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated deep in her own chest. "You threw yourself in front of them for my child." Sienna tried to speak, to tell him she did not want his dirty money or his pity, but only a wet, choking cough escaped her split lips. The world tilted violently on its axis. The cold concrete seemed to open up beneath her, dragging her down into the dark, pulling her under the waves of shock and blood loss. "Do not close your eyes," Lucian commanded, the chilling authority in his tone cracking with raw, unexpected panic. He did not care about the city grime coating her pale skin or the blood soaking into his worn fabric. The ruthless boss of the Chicago underworld slid his powerful arms beneath her broken body, lifting her fragile weight against his pristine cashmere suit with terrifying gentleness. "Get the trauma team ready at the estate," he roared over his shoulder, his voice echoing over the police sirens beginning to wail in the far distance. "Tell them if she dies, they all die." Sienna felt the jarring heat of his broad chest, enveloped entirely by the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and fresh gunpowder, before the darkness finally pulled her under. She drifted through layers of thick, suffocating blackness for what felt like centuries, her consciousness returning in slow, agonizing waves. The first thing she registered was the smell. It was not the familiar, comforting stench of wet garbage, damp concrete, and exhaust fumes that had filled her lungs for 7 years. Instead, the air was crisp, laced with sterile medical alcohol and the faint, intoxicating undertone of expensive sandalwood. Her heavy eyelids fluttered open, struggling against the harsh, warm light spilling from a crystal chandelier above. She was sinking into something impossibly soft. Silk sheets, smooth as water, wrapped around her battered limbs, pulling her down into a mattress that felt like a cloud. Panic, sharp and jagged, pierced through the fog of painkillers. Concrete and cold meant survival. Softness meant a trap. Her survival instincts screamed, a primal warning echoing in her skull. Sienna gasped, trying to sit up, but a blinding explosion of agony erupted in her chest. Her 3 broken ribs ground together, forcing a strangled cry from her split lips. Her vision swam with black spots, but she forced her eyes to focus on her surroundings. The room was terrifyingly opulent. High ceilings adorned with intricate gold leaf molding, walls covered in deep crimson fabric, and heavy mahogany furniture that looked older than the city itself. She was trapped in a gilded cage. Her left arm felt restricted. She looked down and saw a clear tube snaking from the back of her bruised hand up to a hanging bag of clear fluid. Intravenous fluids. They were treating her. But her mind only registered captivity. Her right hand shot out, desperately clawing at the empty space beside the mattress. Her fingers scraped against polished wood, finding nothing. Her rusted metal rod, the cold, heavy iron that had kept her alive through 1,000 frozen nights, was gone. Her only shield against a brutal world had been taken. Breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, Sienna ripped the tape from her hand and tore the needle out of her vein. A bright bead of blood welled up, trailing down her knuckles, but she did not care. She swung her legs over the edge of the massive bed, her bare feet hitting a plush, thick rug that swallowed her toes. The room spun wildly, tilting like a sinking ship, but she gritted her teeth and pushed herself upright. She was wearing an oversized, obscenely soft gray shirt that smelled faintly of that same sandalwood. It was not hers. Nothing here was hers. She needed to escape. She needed the freezing, honest streets. She took one stumbling step toward the heavy double doors, clutching her burning ribs, when the brass handle turned with a heavy, final click. The door swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lucian Moretti filled the doorway, his imposing, broad-shouldered frame blocking her only exit. He wore a crisp, tailored black shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded scars. His thick, dark hair was slightly messy, contrasting with the absolute, terrifying stillness of his storm-gray eyes. He looked at her, standing there trembling and bleeding on his expensive rug, and a muscle ticked in his clenched jaw. "You are tearing your stitches, Sienna," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He knew her name. The realization sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. "Where is my iron?" she demanded, her voice a broken, hoarse rasp that barely carried across the room. "Where are my clothes?" Lucian stepped fully into the room, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft thud that sounded like a vault ceiling shut. "Your clothes were soaked in blood and street grime. They were destroyed. As for your weapon, you will not need it here." Sienna backed away, her knees trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. "You do not understand. I need it. Give it back to me and let me go." Lucian did not rush toward her. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who had already cornered his prey. "You lost nearly half your blood volume. You have 3 fractured ribs, a severe concussion, and advanced malnutrition. If you walk out those doors, you will be dead before you reach the city limits." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that his overwhelming presence seemed to suffocate the remaining air in the room. "And I do not let the people who save my daughter die." Sienna stared up into his hard, ruthless face. "I am not your responsibility," she whispered, wrapping her arms around her broken chest in a desperate attempt to hold herself together. "I do not belong in your world. Let me leave." Lucian looked down at her, his expression unreadable, but a fierce, possessive fire burned in the depths of his gray eyes. "You threw yourself onto the concrete to shield Lily. You fought 4 armed Brava soldiers with a rusted pipe while the rest of the city stood by and watched." He slowly reached out, his large, warm hand coming to rest lightly on her uninjured shoulder, his touch sending an involuntary shiver straight to her core. "You stepped into my world the second you decided her life was worth more than your own. You are staying here, Sienna. You will heal in this bed. You will eat my food. And you will allow me to protect you." Sienna wanted to fight, wanted to scream that she was invisible, that she was nobody, but the suffocating warmth of his hand and the absolute certainty in his voice broke through the last of her defenses. Her legs finally gave out. Before she could hit the floor, Lucian caught her, sweeping her fragile, starved body effortlessly into his strong arms, holding her against his chest as if she were something infinitely precious, something he would burn down the entire city to keep safe. Sienna drifted back into consciousness not with a gasp, but with the silent, measured breathing of a hunted animal pretending to be dead. The suffocating softness of the silk sheets still held her prisoner, and the sterile scent of expensive medical supplies hung heavy in the warm air of the opulent bedroom. She kept her silver-gray eyes tightly shut, tracking the ambient sounds of the mansion. There were no heavy, commanding footsteps echoing on the marble floors, no hushed, dangerous conversations bleeding through the thick mahogany doors. The estate felt deceptively peaceful, a gilded cage draped in an illusion of tranquility. A sharp, burning ache radiated from her 3 broken ribs every time her lungs expanded, reminding her that she was still trapped in a broken body. She slowly cracked her eyes open, the harsh morning sunlight filtering through sheer cream curtains, casting long, golden shadows across the plush rug where she had collapsed yesterday. The intravenous line was gone, expertly removed while she slept, leaving only a small, neat bandage on the back of her bruised hand. She stared at her own knuckles, scraped raw and stained with dried blood that refused to wash away completely, a stark, ugly contrast against the pristine white bedding. She did not belong here. She was a ghost of the Chicago streets, a phantom who survived on discarded bread and icy rainwater. Her survival instincts demanded she rip the covers off, find her rusted iron bar, and vanish into the urban fog before Lucien Moretti realized she was nothing but damaged goods. But before she could force her battered legs to move, a tiny, hesitant shuffle sounded near the doorway. The massive oak door had been left cracked open just an inch. Through that narrow gap, a small, dark-haired figure slipped into the room with the quiet grace of a mouse. Lily wore a fresh pale yellow dress, her dark curls neatly braided, her arms wrapped fiercely around the worn, brown stuffed bear she had almost lost in the park. The 9-year-old girl stopped at the foot of the bed, her big brown eyes wide and watchful, lingering on the dark purple bruises blooming across Sienna's cheekbones. Sienna went perfectly still, holding her breath, not wanting to frighten the child away. For 7 years, ordinary citizens had crossed the street to avoid her hollow eyes and dirty clothes. Children had been yanked away by their mothers, told not to look at the homeless trash sleeping under the overpasses. But Lily did not look away. She did not shrink back in disgust. Instead, she took one tiny, cautious step forward, and then another, until she was standing right beside the mattress. "Are you awake?" Lily whispered, her voice as fragile as spun glass. Sienna slowly nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured neck. "I am awake, little one," Sienna rasped, her throat still raw from the blade and the blood. Lily climbed onto the edge of the enormous bed, her movements careful and deliberate, making absolutely sure not to jostle the mattress and hurt Sienna's ribs. She settled her stuffed bear on the silk covers, then reached into the small pocket of her yellow dress. Her tiny fingers pulled out a folded piece of thick drawing paper, slightly crumpled at the edges. She offered it to Sienna with a shy, hopeful expression that made the street survivor's hardened heart skip a painful beat. Sienna pushed herself up on one elbow, gritting her teeth against the flare of agony, and took the paper with trembling hands. She unfolded it slowly. It was a crayon drawing of a towering, dark-haired man standing beside a little girl, and between them stood a thin woman holding a long gray stick. Above the thin woman, scribbled in bright yellow crayon, was a glowing halo. "You are my superhero," Lily said softly, her brown eyes shining with absolute, unwavering trust. "Daddy told me the bad men wanted to take me away forever, but you stayed. You fought the monsters with your magic iron." Sienna stared at the drawing, a massive lump forming in her throat, choking off her air. She had spent a decade believing she was a failure, a coward who could not save her own sister, a broken vessel who had lost her unborn child. She had fought in the park simply because she had nothing left to lose, fully expecting to die on that wet grass. Yet here was this beautiful, innocent child, looking at her not as street trash, but as a savior. A protector. A superhero. A single, hot tear escaped Sienna's silver-gray eyes, tracking a clean line down her dirty, bruised cheek. She tried to quickly wipe it away, ashamed of her weakness, but Lily's small, warm hand reached out first. The child's soft fingers brushed against Sienna's battered skin, a touch so tender and pure it felt like a holy absolution. "Do not cry, Sienna," Lily whispered, leaning forward to rest her small head gently against Sienna's uninjured shoulder. "You are safe here. Daddy will not let the monsters come back. We will protect you now. Sienna closed her eyes, entirely overwhelmed by the suffocating, terrifying warmth blooming inside her hollow chest. She instinctively wrapped one trembling arm around the little girl, burying her face in Lily's sweet-smelling dark hair, allowing herself to hold and be held for the first time in 10 agonizing years. She did not know that the door had silently swung open wider. She did not know that Lucien Moretti was standing in the shadows of the hallway, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his storm gray eyes locked onto the two of them. The ruthless Mafia King watched the broken street survivor holding his precious daughter, witnessing the fierce, undeniable bond forging between them. He saw the way Sienna's jaw tightened with a silent vow to shield his child, and he realized with absolute clarity that this invisible, battered woman had just become the beating heart of his heavily fortified world. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut with a deafening finality, severing the opulent bedroom from the rest of the silent mansion. Lucien Moretti stood just inside the threshold, the dim glow of the crystal sconces casting harsh shadows across the sharp planes of his face. He had traded his bloodied suit jacket for a stark black button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms corded with tension and faded scars. He did not move immediately. He simply watched her, his storm-gray eyes stripping away the oversized silk shirt she wore, seeing straight through to the fractured ribs and the battered soul beneath. Sienna pulled the thick down comforter tighter to her chin, her knuckles turning white as she forced herself to meet the gaze of the most feared man in Chicago. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the metallic tang of unspoken threats and the lingering scent of sandalwood that seemed to seep from his very pores. "My men swept the alley," Lucien finally said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated in Sienna's aching chest. "They found a rusted iron rod coated in dried blood and rust. They found a makeshift bed of cardboard and damp newspapers hidden behind a dumpster." He began a slow, measured advance toward the edge of the massive bed. "They told me that a woman matching your description has haunted the South Side alleys for 3 years, a ghost who never speaks, never begs, and never draws attention. Yet last night, that same invisible ghost charged 4 fully armed Brava assassins with nothing but a piece of scrap metal." He dragged a heavy leather armchair to the bedside, the legs scraping against the floorboards before he lowered his immense frame into it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his intense face terrifyingly close to hers. "Who sent you, Sienna?" The question hit the air like a physical strike, laced with the cold paranoia of a king who lived his life surrounded by betrayal. Sienna did not flinch, though her fractured ribs screamed in protest as her breathing hitched. "No one sent me," she rasped, her voice still raw and broken from the blade that had pressed against her throat. "I do not know who you are, and I do not care. I only saw a terrified little girl screaming for her life." Lucien's eyes darkened, narrowing into lethal slits. "In my world, no one risks their life for a stranger without an angle. You expect me to believe a starving woman threw herself onto a literal firing line out of pure, uncalculated altruism?" He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers hovering mere inches from the deep purple bruise blooming along her jawline. "People are selfish, Sienna. They preserve their own skin. They walk away. They turn their heads. So tell me the truth. Did a rival family pay you to watch the drop point? Did you know it was my daughter?" Sienna felt a hot, unfamiliar surge of anger pierce through her exhaustion. She slapped his hand away, the sudden movement tearing a gasp of pain from her lips, but she held her ground, her silver-gray eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding fire. "I do not give a damn about your world or your rival families," she spat, her chest heaving as she glared at the mafia boss. "For 7 years, the entire world has looked right through me. Rich men like you step over people like me on the sidewalk every single day. I know what it means to be discarded, to be terrified, to be utterly alone in the dark." She leaned forward, ignoring the agonizing burn in her side, bringing her face inches from his. "When those monsters grabbed her, she looked at me. She looked right at me, and she begged me with her eyes. She was a child. A child. I did not need an angle. I did not need a payout. I jumped because she needed to be saved, and I was the only one standing there who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Lucian froze. The cold, calculating interrogation died in his throat. For a long, suspended moment, he just stared at her, absorbing the raw, unfiltered truth blazing in her silver eyes. He had spent his entire life surrounded by hardened killers, ruthless politicians, and deceitful allies who masked their cowardice with expensive suits and hollow promises. He had interrogated the deadliest men in the country, breaking them until they wept and begged for mercy. Yet here was a woman who weighed less than 100 pounds, shivering in a borrowed shirt, her face battered and her body broken, looking at him with a spirit so impossibly fierce it defied every law of nature he knew. The Mafia King slowly leaned back in the leather chair, the harsh lines of his face relaxing into something closely resembling profound reverence. "You have nothing," he murmured, his voice softening into a quiet, dangerous rumble that sent a fresh wave of shivers down her spine. "You have no money, no home, no protection, and no one to mourn you if you disappear. And yet, you are the bravest creature I have ever encountered." Sienna shrank back into the pillows, her anger quickly fading back into deep, aching exhaustion. "I am not brave. I am just tired. Please, let me go. Let me walk out of here. You have your daughter back. Your debt is settled." Lucian slowly shook his head, a dark, possessive shadow crossing his storm-gray eyes. "You do not understand how my world works, Sienna. You spilled your own blood to shield my blood. You put yourself on the radar of the most vicious Russian syndicate in North America. The Bravo will not forget the street rat who shattered their ransom plan, and they will hunt you down." He reached out again, and this time, Sienna was too tired to pull away. His large, warm palm cupped the side of her face, his thumb gently brushing against the uninjured skin of her cheek. "You think you are going back to the alleys. You think you can just vanish back into the concrete and the rain." He leaned closer, his scent wrapping around her like a heavy, velvet cloak. "But you belong to the Moretti family now. You belong to Lily, and you belong under my roof. I am going to find out exactly what broke you, Sienna. I am going to unearth every single tragedy that turned you into a ghost. And then, I am going to destroy whatever put you on those streets." The absolute, terrifying conviction in his voice offered no room for argument, leaving Sienna to realize with a sinking, fluttery heart that the invisible street survivor had just become the most closely guarded obsession of the most dangerous man in Chicago. The heavy oak desk in Lucian Moretti's private study was covered in scattered photographs and heavily redacted police reports. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating tension, the kind that usually preceded a violent execution. Marco, Lucien's most trusted enforcer, stood perfectly still by the closed door, watching his boss read through the thin manila folder that contained the entire, tragic existence of the woman sleeping in the guest wing. "It took my best men 48 hours to piece this together," Marco said, his voice a low, careful murmur. "She was practically a ghost, boss. No bank accounts, no phone, no digital footprint for 7 years." Lucian did not answer. His storm-gray eyes traced the cold, clinical lines of ink on the paper, each word landing like a physical blow to his heavily guarded heart. Sienna Lawson, 27 years old. Orphaned at the age of 10 and tossed into a broken, abusive foster system. She had married at 19, desperate for a sliver of safety, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare far worse than the system she had escaped. The police reports from 8 years ago detailed multiple noise complaints and domestic disturbance calls at a small apartment on the south side. The final hospital record was a sterile, unforgiving summary of pure agony. Sienna had been 6 months pregnant when her husband, in a drunken rage, had shoved her down a flight of concrete stairs. She had lain bleeding on the floor for 5 hours before a neighbor finally called an ambulance. She had lost the child. The hospital notes indicated severe internal hemorrhaging, 3 broken ribs, and a shattered collarbone. But the darkest part of the file was what happened next. Her husband had drained their meager accounts, blamed her for the loss of the baby, and changed the locks on their apartment while she was still recovering in the intensive care unit. Sienna had been discharged into a freezing November storm with absolutely nothing but the hospital scrubs on her back. For 7 long, brutal years, she had crawled through the darkest alleys of Chicago, sleeping behind dumpsters, fighting off street predators with a rusted iron pipe, and surviving on discarded scraps. Lucien's large, calloused hands began to tremble, crumpling the edges of the police report. He was a man who had forged an empire out of blood and fear, a man who ordered deaths without a second thought, but the image of that fragile, beautiful woman bleeding out alone on a cold floor shattered the ice around his soul. A violent, suffocating rage clawed at his throat, an overwhelming need to find the man who had broken her and tear him apart piece by piece. But beneath the murderous fury was a profound, agonizing ache. He stood up abruptly, the leather chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, and walked out of the study without a single word. He moved through the silent, opulent hallways of the estate, his long strides carrying him straight to the guest wing. He did not bother to knock when he reached her heavy mahogany door. He simply turned the brass handle and stepped inside. Sienna was sitting on the wide window seat, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, swathed in a ridiculously expensive cashmere robe that swallowed her frail frame. She was staring out at the manicured, moonlit gardens, looking so small and incredibly lost. She flinched violently when the door clicked shut, her silver-gray eyes darting toward him like a cornered animal preparing for a strike. Lucien crossed the plush carpet slowly, making sure she could see his empty hands, keeping his movements deliberately unthreatening. He stopped 2 feet away from her and slowly dropped to his knees. The most feared mafia boss in the city knelt on the floor before a homeless street survivor, uncaring of his pride or his power. "I know," he said, his voice a raw, husky whisper that seemed to steal the oxygen from the room. "I know everything, Sienna." He watched the blood drain entirely from her already pale face. Her breath hitched, her fingers digging painfully into the soft cashmere fabric as panic widened her eyes. She expected pity. She expected disgust. She had spent 7 years believing she was nothing more than defective, worthless trash that even the world had forgotten. "Do not look at me," she choked out, turning her face toward the cold glass, a single tear slipping free and tracking down her bruised cheek. "Please, just let me leave. You do not want a broken thing in your perfect house." Lucien reached up, his warm, strong hands gently wrapping around her trembling wrists, slowly pulling them away from her chest. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her scarred knuckles, the gesture so tender it made a sob catch in her throat. "You are not broken," he murmured, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, absolute devotion that anchored her spinning world. "You survived the hell that would have killed the strongest men I know. You walked through the absolute dark for 7 years, and yet you still had enough light left inside you to throw yourself in front of bullets for my daughter." He shifted closer, wiping the tear from her cheek with his thumb. "The man who hurt you is a dead man, Sienna. The streets that starved you will never touch you again. You are not a ghost anymore. I see you. Lily sees you. And I swear on my life, as long as I have breath in my lungs, you will never have to fight for your survival ever again." Sienna stared down at the ruthless king kneeling at her feet, the man who held entire cities in his grip, offering her the one thing she had craved for a decade. She felt the heavy, freezing armor around her heart finally begin to crack, melting beneath the overwhelming heat of his promise. She did not pull her hands away. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, closing her eyes as the first true, healing tears fell, finally allowing herself to believe that the endless, brutal winter of her life was over. The suffocating darkness of the midnight hour pressed heavily against the thick silk curtains of the guest wing, but it was the darkness inside Sienna that finally broke her. She thrashed violently beneath the impossibly soft down comforter, her slender fingers curling into the expensive sheets as if trying to claw her way out of a shallow grave. In her fractured mind, she was no longer safe inside the impenetrable Moretti estate. She was back on the freezing concrete of the south side alleys, the biting wind howling in her ears, mixing with the phantom echoes of her former husband shouting those venomous, degrading curses. Defective, the ghost of his voice sneered, twisting seamlessly into the cruel, vodka-laced laughter of the Bratva soldiers who had tried to drag Lily away. Sweat beaded on Sienna's pale forehead, soaking the collar of the borrowed cashmere shirt, her healing ribs screaming in protest as she twisted away from an unseen, phantom blow. A fractured, terrified whimper tore past her cracked lips, a sound so raw and broken it shattered the absolute silence of the sleeping mansion. Just beyond the thick mahogany door, Lucian Moretti froze. The ruthless king of the Chicago underworld had not slept for 3 days. He had spent the past 3 hours standing in the dimly lit corridor, a silent, unyielding sentinel guarding the door of the woman who had bled for his precious daughter. When the tortured, suffocating cry pierced the heavy wood, Lucian did not hesitate for a single second. He turned the brass handle and stepped silently into the opulent bedroom. His storm-gray eyes immediately locking onto the fragile figure writhing on the massive bed. The sight of her crumbling under the weight of her invisible demons hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was the same fierce, unbreakable woman who had stood between an innocent child and a loaded weapon, the same woman who had looked a mafia boss in the eye and utterly refused his money. But now, stripped of her waking armor, she was nothing more than a terrified, shattered girl drowning in an ocean of unhealed trauma. Lucian crossed the plush rug with long, silent strides, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, agonizing rhythm he had not felt since the day his wife died. He lowered his massive frame onto the edge of the mattress, the bed dipping under his significant weight, but Sienna did not wake. She only whimpered louder, her head thrashing from side to side as a fresh wave of tears slipped from her tightly shut silver-gray eyes, tracking hot and fast down her bruised cheeks. "Please," she begged the empty air, her voice a fragile, ragged rasp. "Please, I have nothing left." The devastated words tore the breath straight out of Lucian's lungs. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire of absolute fear, ordering violent ends for violent men, demanding complete submission from everyone who crossed his path. Yet, as he looked down at this remarkable, broken street survivor, he realized with terrifying clarity that all his money, all his power, and all his ruthlessness meant absolutely nothing if he could not chase the shadows away from her mind. He did not want to be a feared king anymore. He desperately, fiercely wanted to be her permanent safe harbor. Lucian reached out with hands that had ended lives and gently, so incredibly gently, brushed the damp strands of brown hair away from her sweaty forehead. "Sienna," he murmured, his deep, gravelly voice keeping to a soothing, steady rhythm. "You are safe. Open your eyes, little bird. You are safe." She gasped, a violent shudder racking her stark frame, but she did not wake from the nightmare. Instead, her hands flew up blindly, desperately seeking a shield, her fingers wrapping around his thick, scarred wrist with surprising, frantic strength. Lucian did not pull away. He allowed her to grip him, allowed her short nails to dig into his skin, offering himself as a physical anchor in her terrifying storm. He shifted closer, pulling her trembling, sweat-soaked body into his broad chest, being incredibly careful not to press against her fractured ribs. He wrapped his powerful arms around her, enveloping her entirely in his warmth, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head. "I have you," he whispered into her hair, his lips brushing against the soft strands. "The monsters are gone, Sienna. I killed them all. No one will ever hurt you again." The steady, rumbling vibration of his chest and the intoxicating, grounding scent of sandalwood and clean linen slowly began to pierce through her severe night terrors. Sienna's frantic thrashing eased, her rigid muscles slowly melting against the solid, immovable wall of his chest. She did not open her eyes, but she turned her face inward, burying her tear-streaked cheek against his black shirt, her ragged breathing slowly sinking with the deep, calm rhythm of his heart. Lucian held her there in the quiet darkness, his storm-gray eyes fierce and wide awake, silently vowing to the midnight shadows that he would burn the entire world to ash before he ever let her go. Deep in the frozen, decaying underbelly of Chicago, Alexei Volkov slammed his heavy glass of vodka against the scarred wooden table, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the windowless basement. The Bratva lieutenant was a man forged in Siberian winters and blood-soaked turf wars, but right now, his veins burned with a humiliating, scorching rage. 3 days ago, his meticulously orchestrated operation to kidnap the Moretti heir had been shattered, not by a rival syndicate, not by a heavily armed strike team, but by a filthy, starved street rat with a rusted piece of scrap metal. Alexei paced the damp concrete floor, his boots grinding over loose gravel, as he glared at the blurry security photographs scattered across the table. His bruised and battered men had described a phantom, a desperate woman who had fought with the deranged ferocity of a cornered beast, bleeding on the asphalt just to protect a child that did not even belong to her. He snatched up the grainy image of Sienna, caught by a street camera just seconds before the chaos, her thin friend swallowed by an oversized, tattered coat, her silver-gray eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying light. She had humiliated him, costing him millions in ransom and severing his singular chance to cripple Lucian Moretti, and for that, she was going to suffer a very slow, agonizing demise. Alexei turned to his heavily armed enforcer standing in the shadows, his voice a lethal, vibrating growl. "I do not care about the Moretti guards right now," he ordered, slamming a thick, blunt finger onto Sienna's photograph. "I want this ghost. I want the homeless trash who ruined my empire. Find out where she came from. Find out who she loved, who she lost, and dragged every piece of her past into the light. When I am finished tearing her apart, Lucian Moretti will watch her bleed out, and he will know that no one crosses the Bratva." Miles away from that damp, suffocating basement, safely locked behind the towering iron gates and heavily armed patrols of the Moretti estate, Sienna sat perfectly still on the edge of her plush, silk-draped bed. The morning sun poured through the massive bay windows, bathing the luxurious room in a warm, golden glow, yet she felt a familiar, creeping ice sliding down her spine. The phantom weight of being hunted was a heavy, suffocating cloak she had worn for 7 years, and not even the impenetrable fortress of a mafia king could fully chase that bone-deep terror away. She slowly traced the faint, healing bruises along her collarbone, her sharp survival instincts humming with a dark, restless energy. She knew how violent men operated, having narrowly survived the wrath of a husband who had tried to beat the life out of her body. She knew that the monsters who had tried to snatch Lily in that wet, freezing park would not simply walk away and accept defeat. They would regroup, they would sharpen their knives, and they would come looking for the weakest link. Sienna stood up, her bare feet sinking into the thick, imported rug, and walked toward the window overlooking the manicured grounds. Below her, 3 men in dark, tailored suits were sweeping the perimeter. With assault rifles, their faces grim and focused. Lucian had doubled the guard detail overnight, transforming the beautiful estate into a literal military compound. The mafia boss had told her she was safe, promising that the streets would never touch her again, but Sienna's shattered heart still struggled to trust the concept of a permanent sanctuary. She pressed her palms flat against the cold glass, her silver-gray eyes scanning the distant, towering tree line, silently preparing herself for the inevitable war. She had spent a decade running from shadows, hiding behind dumpsters, and praying for invisibility, but as she watched little Lily skipping happily across the lawn below, chasing a stray butterfly with absolute, innocent joy, a new, entirely foreign resolve ignited in Sienna's battered soul. She was not going to run anymore. She was not going to cower in the dark and let another violent man dictate her survival. If the Bratva wanted to drag her back into the freezing hell she had barely escaped, they were going to find out exactly why a starving ghost had managed to survive the deadliest streets in Chicago for 7 brutal years. The afternoon sun bathed the meticulously manicured gardens of the Moretti estate in a warm golden light, but Sienna was not focused on the blooming hydrangeas or the expensive marble fountains. She sat cross-legged on the manicured grass, her frail frame draped in a soft cream sweater that belonged to Lucian, her silver-gray eyes locked onto the small, dark-haired girl sitting opposite her. Lily watched her with unwavering attention, clutching her worn brown bear against her chest. Sienna reached out, her scarred and calloused fingers gently wrapping over Lily's small, pristine hands, the contrast between their worlds stark and agonizing. "You must never let them see you panic, little one," Sienna whispered, her voice rough but incredibly tender, carrying the weight of 1,000 freezing nights. "If the bad men come, you do not scream. Screaming tells them exactly where you are, and it feeds their cruel power." Lily nodded solemnly, her wide brown eyes reflecting a heavy maturity no 9-year-old child should ever have to possess. Sienna picked up a small, smooth stone from the edge of the flower bed and pressed it firmly into Lily's palm. "In the alleys, I survived because I learned how to become a ghost. You must learn to be a ghost, too. When you enter a room, count the doors. Always find 2 ways out. Count them silently in your head." Lily looked up at the towering facade of the mansion, her lips moving without sound as she counted the visible entrances, holding up 3 tiny fingers. A rare, fragile smile touched Sienna's battered face, making the fading purple bruises along her cheekbones stretch painfully. "Exactly, 3 doors," Sienna praised softly, her thumb brushing over the back of the child's hand. "And if the doors are blocked, you find a small space. A cabinet, a crawlspace, behind the heavy bookshelf. You make yourself as small as a mouse, you control your breathing, and you hold on to this stone. You focus entirely on how cold the stone feels, not on how loud your own heart is beating in your ears." From the shadowed archway of the stone terrace, Lucian stood perfectly still, his massive frame blending into the dark stone like a phantom predator. He had been watching them for over 20 minutes, his storm-gray eyes fixed completely on the woman who had bled to shield his child. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders tense, a loaded weapon resting heavy in his shoulder holster. Yet, the ruthless Mafia King felt utterly disarmed. He watched the invisible street survivor, a woman who had been violently discarded by the world, teaching his heir the brutal, absolutely necessary art of survival. Sienna was not offering the child false promises of a fairy tale world or pretending the monsters did not exist. Instead, she was forging a brilliant shield around Lily, weaving her own horrific traumas into unbreakable armor for the girl she had nearly died to protect. Lucian felt an overwhelming, suffocating tightness gripping his chest, an emotion so profound it robbed him of his breath. His heavily guarded heart, a cold organ that had been frozen solid since his wife died, was breaking wide open under the golden afternoon sun. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in Sienna's silver-gray eyes, the way she so gently stroked Lily's dark curls to comfort her, and he realized with absolute clarity that he would happily burn the entire city of Chicago to ashes just to keep them safe. He stepped out of the shadows, his polished leather shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. Sienna flinched instantly, her intense survival instincts flaring as she pulled Lily slightly behind her, her broken body angling immediately to absorb any potential threat. But when her frantic eyes met Lucian's, the sharp tension slowly drained from her fragile shoulders. Lucian stopped just 3 feet away, looking down at the 2 most important people in his heavily fortified world. "You are teaching her to hide," he murmured, his deep voice a velvet rumble that vibrated through the quiet garden. Sienna kept her gaze steady, her chin lifting defiantly despite the lingering pain in her fractured ribs. "I am teaching her to stay alive," she replied, her tone fiercely protective and lacking any trace of intimidation. "Your vast money and your armed guards are out here. But if the monsters ever break through those walls, she needs to know exactly how to save herself." Lucian slowly dropped to one knee, completely uncaring of the expensive fabric of his tailored suit, bringing himself down to their level. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently cupping Sienna's cheek, his thumb brushing tenderly over the fading bruise near her jaw. "She is infinitely safer with you than with 100 armed men," Lucian said, his voice laced with a profound, terrifying devotion that left absolutely no room for doubt. "You are a weapon forged in hell, Sienna, and you are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Sienna's breath hitched, her silver eyes widening at the raw, unfiltered emotion burning deeply in his storm-gray gaze. The cold, starving ghost inside her finally felt the undeniable, overwhelming warmth of a permanent home. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning, the deep, resonant sound echoing through the heavily guarded, silent estate. Sienna had not slept. She wandered the dark, opulent corridors with the silent, practiced steps of a ghost, her bare feet making absolutely no sound against the imported marble floors. The warmth of the mansion still felt like a fragile, borrowed dream, a beautiful illusion that she was terrified would shatter the moment she closed her eyes. As she neared the south wing, a sliver of golden light spilled from beneath the heavy oak door of Lucien's private study. The low, tense rumble of angry voices bled through the thick wood, anchoring Sienna to the shadows. She pressed her back flat against the cold, plastered wall, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized Marco's harsh, urgent tone. "Alexei Volkov is not backing down, boss," Marco stated, his voice laced with grim certainty. "Our scouts in the harbor district just confirmed it. The Bratva are moving heavy artillery, and they have pulled in 50 soldiers from the Northern Syndicate. They are planning a full siege on this estate before tomorrow night. Volkov wants the street girl who ruined his operation, and he is willing to turn this entire property into a graveyard to drag her out of here." Sienna felt all the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin as pale and cold as ice. The warmth of the silk pajamas she wore suddenly felt suffocating, wrapping around her like a shroud. Lucien's voice answered, a terrifying, quiet rumble of pure, unadulterated violence. "Let them try. Double the perimeter. Bring every man we have in the city back to the gates. If Volkov steps 1 foot onto my property, I will personally mount his head on the front gates. No one touches Sienna. No one." The absolute, unwavering devotion in the Mafia King's voice tore a ragged, silent sob from Sienna's throat. He was going to war for her. Lucien was willing to risk his empire, his men, and his own life to shield a worthless street survivor who had offered him nothing but trouble. But the thought that paralyzed her, the agonizing image that turned her veins to ice, was Lily. A full siege meant bullets tearing through the pristine glass windows, smoke filling the warm, quiet hallways, and violence staining the only safe harbor that innocent little girl had ever known. Sienna closed her silver-gray eyes, a single, hot tear slipping down her cheek as the undeniable truth settled heavy and hard in her chest. She had brought this darkness to their doorstep. She was the rot that had drawn the wolves, and she absolutely refused to let Lily pay the price for her survival. Sienna pushed away from the wall, her mind hardening into cold, calculating steel. She slipped back into her luxurious guest suite, shedding the soft, expensive silk and dressing in the darkest, warmest clothes she could find in the massive closet, pulling a thick black turtleneck over her head and lacing up a pair of sturdy leather boots. She moved with frantic, deliberate precision, her survival instincts hijacking her senses, completely shutting down the agonizing pain of her healing ribs. She walked quietly down the hall and stopped outside Lily's bedroom. Pushing the door open just an inch, she watched the little girl sleeping peacefully, her dark curls spread across the white pillows, her worn brown bear clutched tightly in her small arms. Sienna pressed her hand against the wooden frame, her heart shattering into a million jagged pieces as she silently memorized the peaceful rise and fall of the child's chest. "I love you, little one," she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling with an agonizing finality. "I will not let the monsters touch you." She pulled the door shut and turned away, severing the fragile, beautiful bond she had barely begun to weave. Moving like a phantom, she bypassed the main security checkpoints, using the hidden servant corridors she had meticulously mapped out over the past few days. She slipped into the massive, gleaming kitchen, her calloused fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy handle of a sharp carving knife, tucking the steel blade securely into her waistband. She bypassed the heavily guarded front gates, navigating through the dense, shadowed trees of the eastern gardens, finding the narrow blind spot in the camera sweep that she had silently noted during her morning walks. Sienna scaled the ornate iron fence, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through her chest as the cold metal bit into her palms, and dropped heavily onto the freezing, rain-slicked pavement of the street outside. The biting Chicago wind howled around her, instantly piercing through her dark clothes, welcoming her back to the merciless, frozen hell she had tried to escape. She did not look back at the warm, glowing windows of the Moretti estate. She pulled her collar up against the biting frost, her silver-gray eyes locking onto the distant, hazy lights of the harbor district. She was no longer a terrified victim seeking shelter behind the broad shoulders of a mafia king. She was a ghost of the alleys, a weapon forged in absolute darkness, and she was walking straight into the wolf's den to end the Bratva threat before it ever reached the family she had learned to love. The freezing Chicago rain sliced through Sienna like tiny frozen needles as she navigated the labyrinth of the harbor district. She had walked for nearly 2 hours, the bitter wind whipping off Lake Michigan, tearing through her thin black turtleneck and freezing her bones, but the cold outside was absolutely nothing compared to the burning inferno of resolve in her chest. She kept her right hand pressed against the cold steel of the carving knife hidden beneath her jacket, her heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against her healing ribs. She knew exactly where Alexei Volkov operated. In her 7 brutal years on the streets, she had learned the dangerous geography of monsters just to survive. The Bratva commanded the decaying shipping yards on the south side, a desolate graveyard of rusted metal shipping containers and collapsed brick warehouses where no police car ever dared to patrol, and screams were swallowed by the sound of the crashing waves. Sienna crouched low behind a rusted-out sedan, her breath forming small, desperate white clouds in the frigid air, her silver-gray eyes scanning the massive, looming structure ahead. 2 men wrapped in heavy tactical gear stood near the loading dock, assault rifles slung casually over their broad shoulders, thick trails of cigarette smoke pluming from their mouths into the dark sky. They were laughing, sharing a bottle of cheap vodka, completely unaware that a fragile ghost from the alleys was watching them with the desperate, feral focus of a mother protecting her young. Sienna did not have an army behind her, and she did not have millions of dollars or expensive firearms like Lucian Moretti. But she had something far more dangerous. She had a heart that had finally found a home, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose by throwing her life away to keep it safe. She watched the patrol pattern with cold, clinical precision, counting the seconds silently in her head. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 15. The taller guard turned his back to flick his cigarette into a muddy puddle, his partner distracted by the bitter wind. Sienna moved. She did not run, because running made noise. She glided over the wet asphalt like a shadow, slipping through a narrow gap in the rusted chain-link fence and pressing her shivering body against the damp, algae-covered brick of the warehouse wall. Her fractured ribs screamed in absolute agony, a white-hot fire burning deep in her chest with every breath, but she bit down on her bottom lip so hard that the warm, copper taste of blood flooded her mouth, forcing herself to swallow the pain. She crept along the jagged perimeter until she found a rusted, ground-level ventilation grate. It was barely wide enough for a child, but Sienna had been starved for a very long time. Her slender frame contorted painfully as she wedged her calloused fingers into the iron grating, pulling with every single ounce of strength she possessed until the old metal groaned and finally gave way. She slid headfirst into the pitch-black crawlspace, dropping down silently onto a suspended metal catwalk that overlooked the main floor of the cavernous warehouse. The nauseating stench of stale vodka, gun oil, and unwashed bodies rose up to meet her like a physical blow. Below her, under the harsh, buzzing glare of swinging halogen bulbs, Alexei Volkov stood over a sprawling wooden table covered in detailed blueprints of the Moretti estate. He was flanked by 10 heavily armed men, a private army of monsters preparing to invade her sanctuary. "We strike exactly at dawn," Volkov growled, his thick Russian accent dripping with venomous anticipation. "Burn the gates. Slaughter the guards. Bring me the street rat alive, and kill anyone who stands in our way, especially the little girl." Hearing Lily mentioned in that filthy, murderous mouth sent a wave of blinding, catastrophic rage through Sienna. She tightened her grip on the stolen carving knife, her knuckles turning. bone white in the darkness. She knew she could not fight 10 men. It was a guaranteed suicide mission, but if she could just get close enough to Volkov, if she could just drop from the shadows and plunge this cheap kitchen steel into his throat, the snake would lose its head, and the Bratva forces would fracture into panicked chaos. Lucian and Lily would be safe. Sienna crept along the rusted metal catwalk, her silver-gray eyes locked with murderous intent on Volkov. But the shadows in a mafia warehouse are never completely empty. As she took another agonizingly silent step forward, the weakened, rusted metal beneath her left boot let out a loud, piercing shriek. Volkov's head snapped up instantly, his dark eyes locking directly onto the catwalk above. There, he roared, pointing a massive finger at the shadows. Bring her down. Before Sienna could scramble backward toward the ventilation shaft, a massive hand clamped around her ankle, yanking her violently backward. She thrashed and kicked, twisting like a feral cat, driving the blunt handle of her knife into her unseen attacker's face. The man cursed loudly, his grip loosening just enough for her to scramble away, but there were simply too many of them. Heavy boots thundered up the metal stairs. 3 enormous men swarmed the narrow catwalk, their massive bodies blocking any possible chance of escape. Sienna fought with everything she had left, biting, clawing, and kicking out with a desperate, animalistic fury. She managed to slash one man across the forearm, drawing a sharp cry of pain, but a heavy fist slammed brutally into her temple, sending the world spinning into a blinding blur of dark, violent colors. The carving knife clattered uselessly onto the grated floor, slipping through the cracks and falling into the light below. Rough, brutal hands grabbed her by the hair and the arms, dragging her limp, battered body down the steel stairs and throwing her violently onto the freezing concrete floor directly at Alexei Volkov's polished boots. Sienna gasped, spitting a mouthful of warm blood onto the dirty floor as she forced herself to look up into the eyes of the devil himself. She had failed to kill him, but as she glared at the Bratva leader with a defiant, burning hatred, she felt no regret whatsoever, knowing in her broken heart that every second she kept their violent attention focused on her was. Another second Lucian and Lily remained perfectly safe in their worn, impenetrable fortress. The harsh, blinding glare of a swinging halogen bulb pierced through the heavy darkness, forcing Sienna to blink against the sharp, stinging light as she drifted back into a torturous, agonizing consciousness. She was bound tightly to a rusted metal chair in the dead center of the cavernous, freezing warehouse, heavy iron chains biting mercilessly into her bruised wrists and slender ankles with every shallow, shivering breath she took. The suffocating stench of damp concrete, stale cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of her own spilled blood filled her lungs, a brutal reminder of the violent world she had willingly surrendered herself to. Alexei Volkov paced around her like a starved, rabid predator, his heavy combat boots grinding against the loose gravel and broken glass that littered the floor. He stepped directly into the pool of light, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice, and backhanded her across the face with a leather-gloved fist. The brutal impact snapped her head to the side, sending a fresh wave of blinding, white-hot agony radiating through her fractured skull and down her delicate neck. "Tell me the security codes to the southern gate, street rat," Volkov snarled, grabbing a fistful of her dark, tangled hair and wrenching her head back so violently she felt the skin of her scalp tear. "Tell me exactly how many guards rotate at dawn, and tell me the blind spots in the camera feeds. Speak right now, and I might let you die a quick, merciful death." Sienna tasted the warm, heavy copper flooding her mouth, feeling the thick, hot drops sliding down her chin to stain the collar of her black turtleneck. For 7 brutal years, she had endured the freezing, unforgiving alleys of Chicago, scavenging for discarded scraps behind restaurant dumpsters and hiding in the shadows from monsters who wanted to use her up and throw her away. Before that, she had endured the merciless, drunken fists of a husband who had tried to beat the very soul out of her frail body every single night. Physical pain was her oldest, most familiar companion, a harsh language she spoke completely fluently. But as Volkov drove his heavy knee into her already broken ribs, stealing the breath straight from her lungs with a sickening, audible crunch, Sienna did not scream, nor did she shed a single tear. Instead, a vivid, beautiful image blossomed in her fractured mind, bright and undeniably warm against the surrounding, suffocating darkness. She saw Lily's sweet, innocent face lighting up as she successfully folded a fragile paper crane, her small hands clapping with pure, unadulterated joy in the sunlit parlor of the estate. She felt the ghost of Lucien's massive, warm hand gently cupping her scarred cheek in the moonlit garden, his deep, rumbling voice vowing to burn the entire world to ashes just to keep her safe. They were her family now, the only true sanctuary her shattered heart had ever known, and she would gladly endure 1,000 lifetimes in this agonizing, rusted hell before she ever let the Brava touch a single, precious hair on their heads. Volkov let out a frustrated, furious roar, backhanding her again with enough force to rattle her teeth, but Sienna only slowly turned her face back toward him, her silver-gray eyes blazing with an unyielding, feral light that made the surrounding enforcers shift nervously in the shadows. Her dry lips parted, stretching the painful splits in her skin, and she offered the Russian monster a wide, blood-soaked, defiant smile. "You are nothing but a dead man walking," she whispered, her voice a ragged, raspy scrape that echoed softly in the damp, freezing air. "When Lucian realizes I am gone, he will not just kill you. He will tear your entire syndicate apart piece by bloody piece, and he will make you beg for the very death you are threatening me with." Volkov's face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury, his hand dropping to the heavy, serrated combat knife strapped to his thigh. He dragged the cruel, cold blade slowly across her collarbone, a shallow, stinging cut designed purely to inflict maximum psychological and physical torment, but Sienna kept her gaze locked dead onto his, her smile never once faltering. She focused her mind entirely on the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and clean linen that always clung to Lucien's shirts, letting that phantom warmth wrap around her shivering, battered body like an impenetrable, invisible shield. The physical torment was excruciating, the heavy, rusted chains scraping her skin raw and bloody with every agonizing breath, her entire starved frame screaming for release, yet her spirit remained entirely, utterly unbroken. She was no longer the frightened, invisible ghost who flinched at loud noises and apologized for taking up space in the world. She was the weapon forged in hell, the shield protecting a little girl's innocent dreams, the silent guardian of a mafia king's fragile, healing heart. Every single strike Volkov landed, every drop of blood that hit the dirty, oil-stained concrete, was a sacred, silent vow that she was keeping her family safe from the wolves. "Hit me again," she challenged softly, spitting a mouthful of blood onto his polished boot, her silver-gray eyes burning with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a woman who had already won the war. "Hit me 100 more times, Alexei. It will not matter. You have already lost, because you cannot break something that has finally found a magnificent reason to live." The heavy mahogany clock in the grand foyer chimed 4 o'clock in the morning, its deep vibration doing absolutely nothing to settle the dark, violent storm brewing inside Lucian Moretti. He had spent the last 2 hours personally checking every single security perimeter, his storm-gray eyes scanning the freezing Chicago darkness for any sign of the Brava threat Markel had warned him about. But the true danger had not come from the outside. The true danger was the quiet, agonizing emptiness that hit him the moment he silently opened the door to the guest suite to check on the woman who had consumed his entire soul. The massive, silk-draped bed was perfectly made, completely untouched and completely empty. Lucian froze, his broad shoulders instantly going rigid as the faint, lingering scent of cheap soap and sheer, terrified desperation faded into the cold air blowing through the slightly cracked window. He crossed the plush carpet with long, predatory strides, his massive hands gripping the windowsill as he stared out into the freezing night, the horrifying reality crashing into him with the force of a physical blow. Sienna had not run away in fear. She had heard the threat, she had measured the impossible danger heading toward little Lily, and she had walked straight into the freezing, lethal jaws of the enemy just to spare his new family from the crossfire. For 3 agonizing years since his wife was violently taken, Lucian had carefully maintained the cold, unfeeling mask of an untouchable mafia king, tightly leashing the absolute monster that lived inside his chest. But as he stared at the empty, cold bed, that fragile, civilized leash snapped completely and irrevocably. He did not shout, and he did not throw things like a petulant, reckless child. Instead, an aura of pure, suffocating death settled over him, turning his storm-gray eyes into bottomless pits of absolute murder. He remembered the way her small, calloused hands had trembled when she first tried to return his coat, the way her silver-gray eyes had looked at him with such profound, unearned gratitude. She was a woman who had been thrown away by the entire world, brutalized and starved, yet she still possessed a heart capable of sacrificing herself for a child she barely knew. The sheer, overwhelming injustice of it fueled the monstrous, suffocating rage clawing at his throat. He walked out of the suite, his heavy boots striking the marble floors with the terrifying, rhythmic certainty of an executioner. "Marco," Lucian commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that instantly paralyzed every single armed guard standing in the corridor. "Empty the armory. Wake every single man we have on the payroll. We are going to the harbor district right now." Marco took one look at his boss' face, saw the catastrophic, unhinged wrath radiating from his pores, and immediately began barking orders into his radio. Within 10 minutes, the pristine, silent courtyard of the Moretti estate exploded into chaotic, synchronized motion. 50 heavily armed soldiers poured out of the barracks, racking slides on assault rifles and loading thick, heavy tactical vests with extra ammunition. Lucian strapped a secondary weapon to his thigh, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached, his mind locked entirely on the fragile, brave street survivor who was currently bleeding for his sins. He climbed into the back of the lead armored vehicle, completely ignoring the freezing rain that soaked through his expensive cashmere coat. A massive convoy of 12 black SUVs tore out of the iron gates, their heavy tires shredding the wet asphalt as they sped toward the decaying, rusted underbelly of the south side. Lucian sat in the suffocating darkness of the moving vehicle, his massive hands curling into tight, lethal fists. He imagined Sienna out there alone in the freezing, merciless cold, terrified and starving, facing down brutal men who wanted to tear her apart just to send him a message. The thought was a white-hot brand pressing directly into his brain. He had built his entire criminal empire on absolute fear and ruthless control, demanding that the entire city of Chicago bow to his whim. Yet, as the convoy roared through the desolate, rain-swept streets, running every single red light and scattering the miserable night traffic, Lucian realized that all his money, all his vast territory, and all his immense power meant absolutely nothing if he was too late to save her. He was going to slaughter Alexei Volkov. He was going to paint the cracked concrete of the warehouse floor with Brava blood, and he was going to burn their entire syndicate to ash. No one took what belonged to him. No one touched the fragile, invisible woman who had crawled out of the filthy gutters to shield his deaf daughter. The convoy took a sharp, aggressive turn toward the docks, the rusted metal skeletons of the shipping containers looming in the dark, frozen distance. Lucian checked the safety on his weapon, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the distant, dim lights of the enemy stronghold, whispering a dark, lethal promise to the freezing wind that he would drag her out of that hell even if he had to rip the devil himself into 1,000 bloody pieces. Sienna's vision blurred into a dizzying smear of rusted iron and spilled blood as Alexei Volkov raised his heavy combat knife for another agonizing strike. The cold, suffocating air of the harbor warehouse pressed down on her fragile lungs, every shallow breath sending a white-hot spike of pure agony through her shattered ribs. She closed her silver-gray eyes, silently whispering a final, desperate prayer for little Lily and the terrifyingly beautiful Mafia King who had given her a brief, borrowed taste of a real home. But before the Russian monster could bring the jagged blade down across her throat, the massive, reinforced steel doors of the warehouse violently exploded inward. A deafening, catastrophic roar of shattered concrete and twisting metal shook the very foundation of the building, sending a blinding cloud of thick gray dust and falling debris raining down upon them. Volkov stumbled backward, dropping the knife as the deafening percussion of automatic gunfire ripped through the freezing night air. Through the suffocating smoke and blinding glare of heavy tactical headlights, a towering silhouette emerged like the Grim Reaper himself stepping straight out of hell. Lucian Moretti did not walk into the warehouse, he descended upon it with the catastrophic, unholy wrath of a god denied his absolute worship. He moved with a terrifying, predatory fluidity, his storm-gray eyes completely devoid of mercy or human restraint as he raised his customized assault rifle. The deafening cacophony of relentless gunfire drowned out the desperate, frantic screams of the Bratva soldiers as Lucian and his heavily armed convoy mercilessly slaughtered every single man who stood in their path. Sienna watched through a haze of tears and blood as the man she loved transformed into a monster of pure, unadulterated vengeance, painting the cracked concrete floor a deep, slick crimson. Volkov desperately scrambled for his fallen weapon, spitting panicked curses in Russian, but Lucian crossed the cavernous space in 3 massive, lethal strides. With a sickening, hollow crunch, Lucian drove his heavy combat boot directly into Volkov's kneecap, shattering the bone instantly and dropping the massive Russian to the filthy floor. Lucian did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He gripped Volkov by the throat, his massive hands flexing with devastating power, and effortlessly hoisted the screaming man completely off the ground before violently snapping his neck with a swift, merciless twist. The brutal, agonizing reign of the Bratva ended right there in the cold, pooling blood. Lucian dropped the lifeless body like discarded trash, his chest heaving heavily beneath his ruined cashmere coat, the metallic stench of gunpowder radiating from his skin. The terrifying storm of violence ceased almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its bloody wake. Lucian dropped his weapon onto the concrete and dropped to his knees in the filth directly in front of the rusted metal chair, his storm-gray eyes searching Sienna's battered, bruised face with a desperate, frantic terror she had never seen in him before. His massive, blood-stained hands trembled violently as he gripped the heavy iron chains binding her wrists, completely ignoring the sharp metal tearing into his own skin as he shattered the rusted locks with sheer, impossible brute strength. Sienna collapsed forward, her broken, starved body finally giving out, but she did not hit the freezing floor. Lucian caught her, pulling her small, fragile frame securely against his broad chest, wrapping his strong arms around her with a fierce, absolute possession that stole the very breath from her lungs. "I have you," Lucian whispered, his deep, rumbling voice breaking with raw, unchecked emotion as he buried his face into her dark, matted hair. "You are safe now, my brave, foolish girl, you are completely safe." Sienna weakly raised her trembling, bruised hand. Curling her cold fingers into the lapel of his ruined coat, inhaling the intoxicating, familiar scent of sandalwood and expensive linen that somehow managed to pierce right through the copper stench of blood. "I had to protect Lily," she rasped, her throat raw and dry like sandpaper, hot tears slipping down her pale, battered cheeks. "I could not let them take our home." Lucian let out a jagged, broken breath, pressing his warm lips against her blood-stained forehead with a desperate reverence, silently vowing right then and there that he would spend the rest of his dangerous life worshipping the incredible, selfless woman who had walked into absolute hell just to save his family. He scooped her up effortlessly into his powerful arms, carrying her away from the darkness and the bodies, holding her fiercely against his heart as they walked back out into the freezing, rain-swept night, absolutely determined to bring his queen back to the warm, safe sanctuary where she truly belonged. 6 months later, the gentle, golden warmth of the late afternoon sun washed over the sprawling marble balcony of the Moretti estate. Sienna stood quietly by the ornate stone railing, the soft, expensive silk of her emerald green dress fluttering lightly in the sweet summer breeze. She traced her fingertips over the smooth, sun-baked stone, marveling at the simple, profound peace that had finally settled over her shattered life. The deep, agonizing fractures in her ribs had long since healed into faded, silver scars, and the terrifying, freezing alleys of Chicago were nothing more than a distant, fading nightmare. She was no longer the starving, invisible street ghost who had shivered behind rusted dumpsters, terrified of her own shadow and bracing for the next cruel blow. She had fought through absolute hell, she had bled on cold concrete for the people she loved, and she had emerged entirely reborn. Down in the pristine, blooming gardens below, little Lily was running through a labyrinth of vibrant red roses, her dark curls bouncing as she chased a bright yellow butterfly. The little girl suddenly stopped, turned her sweet, innocent face up toward the balcony, and raised her small hands, signing the words for love and mother with a radiant, gap-toothed smile that absolutely shattered Sienna's heart in the most beautiful way possible. Sienna smiled back, her silver-gray eyes filling with warm, happy tears as she signed the words back to the precious child she had sworn to protect with her life. It still felt like a beautiful, fragile dream, knowing that this bright, joyful child had once been trapped in a terrifying silence, and now her laughter, though soundless, vibrated with absolute joy throughout the entire mansion. The heavy, polished oak doors behind her opened with a soft, familiar click, and the atmosphere on the sunlit balcony instantly changed. It was not a terrifying shift, but a deep, comforting gravity that signaled the arrival of the only monster she would ever love. Lucian stepped out into the sunlight, his imposing, broad-shouldered frame dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute fear and respect from the entire city, but his storm-gray eyes held nothing but pure, unadulterated adoration as they locked onto Sienna. He had changed, too, shedding the impenetrable, icy armor he had worn for 3 long years, allowing the fierce, burning devotion inside his chest to finally guide him. He moved with that silent, predatory grace, crossing the distance between them until he was close enough for her to inhale the intoxicating, familiar scent of expensive sandalwood, gun oil, and clean rain. Lucian wrapped his strong, massive arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his solid, unyielding chest, and buried his face into the crook of her neck. "You are thinking too loudly again, my brave girl," he murmured, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating against her skin and sending a cascade of warm, delicious shivers down her spine. Sienna leaned back into his protective embrace, resting her hands over his large, scarred knuckles. "I was just thinking about how very far we have come," she whispered. Softly, turning her head slightly to press a tender kiss against his shadowed jaw. "I used to pray just to survive the freezing nights, and now I have a family, a home, and a terrifying king who tore the entire harbor district apart to keep me safe." Lucian tightened his grip, turning her gently in his arms so he could look down into her shimmering eyes, his expression fierce and fiercely devoted. "You were never just surviving, Sienna," he vowed, lifting a large hand to gently cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the faint, faded scar near her temple that Alexei Volkov had left behind. "You were waiting for us. You brought the light back into this dead, silent house, and you saved my daughter when the rest of the world turned a blind eye. You are the absolute queen of this empire, and I will spend every single second of the rest of my life making sure you never feel cold, hungry, or invisible ever again." He lowered his head, capturing her lips in a deep, passionate kiss that tasted of absolute devotion and a beautiful, hard-won forever. Sienna closed her eyes, melting into the safe, burning heat of her husband, finally knowing down to her very bones that the terrified, broken street girl was completely gone, replaced by a woman fiercely loved and fiercely guarded. As the golden sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Chicago sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange, they stood perfectly still, 2 fractured souls completely healed by a love forged in blood and concrete, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought, so long as they faced it together. Thank you so much for listening to this Sunni romance original story, and I really have to ask, did you completely fall in love with Lucian's ruthless, protective devotion as much as I did?